Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. If no one's told you today, you are incredible. And I am forever grateful to have you as supporters for the Back to Ashes channel. Down below in the description box, if you enjoy what you are hearing, you can buy me a coffee, as it does support me and the channel. If you would like to become a member of Back to Ashes, it's only $1.99 a month. Perks include, you get videos a day before the public release, you get priority responses in the comments, and much more. Now, before we get started, I'd like to explain my new way of telling stories. I will start with short stories first and then go into the long form stories in these videos. That way you can go ahead and get adjusted in bed, go ahead and get a listen to the first story, let that ambience of rain start taking over. And then once the few short stories are done, the long stories kick in, which should help you completely take off on your journey to Slumberland. With all of that being said, it is time to go back to ashes, for when we return to the ashes, we arise a bigger, brighter, better, and stronger, happier person in the morning. Sit back, relax, kick back, grab a snack, or tuck in and get warm, and enjoy this dose of vocal melatonin entitled More True Backwoods Creepy. (2006) Pinnacle Lake Trail, Washington. I was camping with my wife and son, and we decided to go for a hike. We walked probably less than a mile and came across a small trail leading to a kind of small, boggy pond in the rainforest. It was a misty day with a light rain. The pond was darkened by tall trees hanging with moss. We were going to venture in there as it was pretty, but somewhat creepy. We probably spent 2 minutes navigating our way over and under some downed trees when my wife said, "We need to leave now." I asked what was up, and she just felt very uneasy, like something bad was present there. I said, "Hun, if you feel that uneasy, then let's go." Her intuition has served her and us well in the past, so I was trusting her instinct. It didn't hurt to simply leave. We made our way back to camp and drove home the next evening. When we arrived home, we saw the local news story of 2 women who were murdered just 2 miles up the trail the day after we were hiking there. Could my wife have sensed a killer or simply some other thing? If we had stayed, would we too become the victims? The case of the 2 women is still unsolved. (1994) The hills of Bella Vista, California, east of Redding, south of Lake Shasta. I had guests staying at my remote cabin. One evening, my friend was outside with his wife and ran inside. "You have to come see this." I was like, well, shit, now what? As many strange things occurred in those remote woods. I leisurely follow him outside, off the deck, and out into the backyard. He says, "Look," pointing above the cabin roof. Directly above the cabin are these baseball-size flashes of blue electricity, like 25 at once or more. They were randomly flashing as if a bunch of cameras were going off. There was no sound to them. I can't recall how long this lasted. Judging from the time they must have seen them, came all the way inside to tell me, and still occurring once I got inside. It must have been at least 3 minutes that the flashes occurred. I lived there for a few years and never experienced this before, but it wasn't entirely surprising. Now I'm second guessing continuing to stay here, as I do not know what intentions these flashes of blue electricity have. So, last year, I went backpacking in the Central Sierras with a friend. We were about to go set up camp in a spot just a few feet off the trail. I ventured further away from the trail on this rocky area to get a better view of the lake. If you look close enough, there was a trail, not on any map, but a clear trail nonetheless, that looked like it led to the base of a peak, which is known for climbing. I started following it, and I came across the most peculiar camp setup. It wasn't like any backpacking setup I'd ever seen. There were a couple of backpacking tents, but there was also those white foldable tables, a canopy tent, and a grill. A full-on cabinet-style backyard grill. Clearly heavy equipment that requires at least 2 people to carry each item. The nearest road was 6 miles away, and the only way up to that spot was foot or horse. How the hell did they manage to haul all that stuff up there? I didn't see anyone around. I saw all that stuff, turned around, and let my friend know. She went up to check it out, but she didn't see anything. Either she didn't walk down the trail far enough, or my mind completely made that up. Maybe the altitude and sun exposure got to me. Either way, I didn't feel safe staying there, so we decided to camp elsewhere. Does anyone know how that stuff could have gotten up there? It still worries me to this day. So, there's a park in Tucker, Georgia, called John's Homestead. What it actually is an old vacant farmhouse that sits awkwardly in disarray alongside a busy highway. Some 100-year-old homestead donated to the country to build a park and trail system over a few good acres. Although the adjacent highway is often busy, this particular patch could almost pass as the rural back road it once was. The homestead, 2 churches established a century ago, old cemeteries, and a few acres of wood in between bustling urban communities. To be honest, I don't remember much of the history of the place. Aside from the landowner being named John Johns, and an old picture of him didn't look too happy. I know the entire property creeps me out, though. I only went a handful of times, not too far down the trail from the parking area, which is maybe a quarter-mile from the homestead. I suddenly felt like I was being watched. It suddenly got quiet. I still made it to the old house, then circled back around. I stopped another time and had the same creepy feeling the whole time. And I'm telling you, you feel so far off the road and into the woods, despite having that highway running virtually right beside you the entire time. So, I told myself I wasn't going back. But I did one more time. I really wanted to take a stroll before dark, and I was running late coming home, so I pulled over to John's Homestead. I don't remember it feeling too weird on the trail. Maybe it was the heavier evening traffic I could easily hear through the trees. Maybe it was the two middle-aged women on a blanket near the small stream sipping wine. Only time I've ever encountered others on this small trail. But the walk to the house was fine. I get to the house, walking around it, noticing how pitch black it seems inside, despite the apparent lack of complete and intact boarding on the doors and windows. It's got a chain link around it since it was deemed structurally unsafe. Very suddenly, I realize it's about to get dark on me, and that feeling starts creeping back. So I swiftly walk back towards the trail. I'm just a few steps back into the wooded area when I heard a loud thud. Something big hit the ground. My brain is trying to convince me it was a tree limb, but I immediately realized there were no snaps or cracks. I look around for just a few seconds, but briskly walk my way out of there and get to my car, as it's getting just too dark to see. I didn't think much of it until I read a few days later that human remains were found just a few feet away from where I was standing when I heard the noise. Other than a body found, the county never released an identity or any more details, and this was over a year ago. So maybe this little spot in Tucker isn't exactly backwoods now, but what's there that feels off? Why did this one small stretch of woods never get developed? What's so special about this particular crumbling house? It looks so out of place in the bigger picture of the area. What the hell did I hear? Who was found dead? And what exactly happened? My brother is 2 years older, and we've probably spent 10,000 hours and then some in the woods together. Whether it was building forts or BMX tracks to LARPing and hunting. We've traveled across the U.S. exploring caves, canyons, cliff diving, mountain biking, camping, hunting white-tailed mule deer, wild boar, etc. since 2016, when we get the time off. I feel like adding this is important because there's genuinely nothing I wouldn't do or fear when I have him by my side. But this time was different, and we both felt it. We've had our fair share of adventures and stories to tell of all sorts, but this one has felt like a lingering stain on my memory. We were both mid-20ish, and it was 2019, and this was probably my 5th time hunting the area, and the first I brought my brother along. It's a large forest area of public land that has a few county roads, which are basically two tracks that stretch miles throughout the area. We make the trip up in my truck with our tents, 3 in total, one for each of us and another to change in and keep our gear in. Without making this long-winded, we set up camp a couple miles from the truck, which we drove for quite a few miles through the trails. Basically, to the middle of nowhere. Nearest main road is probably 8 to 10 miles away. We arrived late in the night, set up camp, and quickly fell asleep after a long trip. We then spent the next day scouting and tracking, then made back to camp for the night. We cooked, then ate, had some beers, and bullshitted. The night was still early, but we had a long day and decided to head off for the night. Everything up until this point was normal. I was suddenly awoke to something smacking my tent and hearing my brother's voice call my name. I knew something was off. I called back to him, and he immediately unzipped my tent and made his way inside. I could tell he was disturbed when I went to ask him what's wrong, and he immediately grabbed my shoulder and told me to shush. The sun wasn't up yet, so I think it was around 4:30, maybe 5-ish a.m. We sat in my tent, and what we heard still confuses me to this day. I can only explain it as whale sounds. Different tones of extremely loud noise that I could feel throughout my body. It would come and go, but there would only be a few seconds of silence in between the sounds. It would vary from high-pitched squeals and everything in between to very low sounds that had literal ground-shaking reverb. I regrettably didn't think to grab my phone or record anything that was going on, because what I was hearing didn't seem real, and in the moment, I was awestruck. The sound went on until daylight started to break. I believe it was about an hour, but I'm not really sure. Neither of us spoke, and at the time, it felt like I could feel the energy around me, almost like my body was covered in white noise, if that makes sense. It wasn't even minutes after the sound stopped. It started to rain, and one of the craziest thunderstorms while I was camping happened. The forecast didn't predict or account for any rain the days we were going to be there prior to making the trip. All the stakes for the tent our gear was in completely ripped out of the ground, and both of our tents had multiple stakes ripped out as well. Those things were drove into the ground with an axe and would take some insane force to unearth even a single one. My brother dismisses it and won't even talk about it, saying it was just machinery being dragged. But at the same time, we both shared the same feeling of fear and dread. It just seems odd it was still the middle of the night, and we were so far removed from any nearby communities or industries to hear and experience the same occurrence at the same time. Needless to say, my brother and I never visited that spot ever again. Hello, everyone. First things first, English is not my main language, so I will try my hardest to make the story make sense. Here is my experience. I'm a 27-year-old female that lives in a small town in North Italy, a valley between our typical old mountains, round shapes covered in forest, not high. So, just behind my home, lots of hikes start. I always lived here, and I like mountains. Plus, I'm getting in shape, so the terrain is ideal, especially because I'm really familiar with it. Last summer, I was walking my usual route when I thought I could try to have a short hike before sunset, and took a route. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Italian ground, but there aren't the big spaces and long distances typically of the US, I imagine. Picture the average small town of 2,500 people, starting from bottom in a 2/3 hike. You're on top of the mountain, and the route I took was about 30 minutes to arrive halfway to the mountain, to a big Christian cross and a nice view. I was with my dog, a well-trained Spitz, a nice company with good instincts that I trust. He's a working dog, more than a pet, despite his size. So, we took the path and started making our way up, nice and relaxed, but active as we didn't have too much time left. I just figured that if light went low, I'd just turn around and head home. No chances of getting lost. The woods immediately engulf us. Pretty dense, but it's the norm. Not even 15 minutes of walking, and I'm paralyzed with this overwhelming sense of dread. The woods are completely silent. My skin crawls just thinking about it. Even my dog stops. He's very anxious. I just couldn't understand what was scaring me so much in that sudden silence. I couldn't move a muscle. I've read The Gift of Fear, and the only time I didn't listen to my gut, I lost my spleen in an accident. So wide-eyed and hyper-alert, I forced myself to move and note out of there. It was like my brain was screaming, "If you stay here, you'll die." Walking back, I couldn't stop the urge to continuously look behind me. At some point, I was practically running, and I kept thinking that if I sprained an ankle, then I would die. The dog seemed relieved when we had returned back, and he kept looking behind us too. When we finally made it out of the woods and back on the road, I felt a wave of relief and ran all the way back home for the adrenaline that I still had. To this day, I have no idea what happened, and I haven't gone back. When I was growing up, we lived near a town called Welty in Oklahoma. It's really not much of a town. Just a tiny store, some churches, a lot of woods, and a ton of farms. We lived off the main road, close to an area called Macabre, which is also nothing but farms and a cemetery, and not even considered a town. Very middle of nowhere. My family told a lot of creepy stories about this place. especially having to do with orbs and weird deer. I do have memories of seeing orbs floating over the trees, and have no idea what those were, but I never personally saw anything else. My dad has always been a skeptic and never chimed in on these stories. He has Alzheimer's and has a great memory of the past, but horrible short term. The other day, he was telling me how much he loved living out there and wished he could still live there. But I brought up the orbs and the creepy stories my family always shared. He agreed that they were always creeped out there. But then, he told me he actually saw something really odd once. He told me one night he was sitting on the porch by himself, and a man ran through our yard, wearing what looked like a deer head. Not just the antlers, but like he had the actual deer's head on his own. He just ran through and continued on down the pitch black road. My dad didn't know what to think of it. He just told me he thought people out there had too much time on their hands. My mother and brother also saw what they said was a deer walking upright all the way down the road. I know deer do this, but they said it just kept walking like that in the middle of the road. My aunt also said they passed a man who was wearing a deer's head on the road one night. There aren't street lights in this area, so he was just out there in the dark, on that road alone, just standing there, doing God knows what. I'm actually glad we don't live there anymore. In the fall of 1998, I went to Somerset, Vermont, to go camping along the Somerset River. A forest road runs up to an airfield with free dispersed campsites. It was first come, first serve, and in the summertime, it would be packed with kids, partying and living their best lives. Still, my girlfriend and I planned this trip in the fall, because the fall leaves in Vermont are something special to see, and we knew the campground would be empty in the middle of the work week during the off-season. I set up our camp and we walked around the woods, down to the river, and just enjoyed the season's natural beauty. We lay in the tent, talking as the sun went down and eventually drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up to two voices outside our tent. It sounded like two men whispering to each other, but it wasn't in English. I couldn't distinguish what they were saying, but distinctly heard two male voices. Suddenly, there was a long, low whistle from off in the distance, and I heard one of the men make a click sound in acknowledgement. Everything was quiet after that. I waited until sunrise and went outside the tent and looked around. I didn't see anyone. My heart was pounding in my chest and I was wide awake. I woke my girlfriend up and we left. I still wonder where those guys came from and why they used whistling and clicking sounds to communicate. The Somerset campground is far off the beaten path, and I didn't hear or see any signs of a vehicle. Rural Vermont has a lot of strange legends and folklore. Years after this happened, I learned about the Bennington Triangle and the disappearances of people in the 1950s. I left the state and joined the Army a few months later. I've only been back to Vermont a few times since that, but I never camped there again. I'm a former longtime airborne ranger, having served for many years in Washington State. After my service, I was a Forest Service firefighter and disaster response contractor. Suffice to say, I'm a very experienced outdoorsman, professionally trained. In 2009, I was hiking in the Weyerhaeuser Forest Reserve near Alfault Lake in western Washington State. The preserve was adjacent to the home of a buddy's father, and before setting off into the lumber preserve, his father had employed for me not to go camping in there alone, as it was a very dangerous area, a very frightening area. He had lived there for 30 years and refused to let his kids ever step foot into that forest. Being a young, confident ranger, I laughed off his superstition and headed out into the virgin forest. It was an unusually hot and humid day in late spring, and I was armed with a Glock 19 9mm pistol and feeling very capable and competent. I had made it about 3 miles into the forest and came to a massive bowl section of perfectly manicured pine forest with no undergrowth. Just tan spruce pine needle bed as far as the eye could see. It looked like I was stepping down into a forest bowl the size of a modern football stadium. I got about halfway down the bowl, and literally every sound in the forest became totally, deafeningly silent. All in an instant. It was as though I had stepped into a soundproof studio room in one step. No bugs, no wind, no ambient sound, nothing. By this time, I had been to combat twice and graduated Ranger School, and was a pretty salty individual. But I am not ashamed to admit, I was overcome with a feeling of fear, dread, deep guttural, paralyzing fear. I gathered myself together and turned around and practically ran the entire way back to Curtis's father's house. Got in my truck and left, and never went back. I've spent years thinking about what happened in those woods, and to this day have no answers. I was completely sober, fully aware of my surroundings, and in good spirits and health at the time of this incident, with no mental, physical, or psychological issues. I cannot say what the incident was caused by, but I have never been so deeply in fear in my life. Even thinking about it, now over a decade later, makes me feel uneasy, as though whatever was in that forest is still there. All this I swear on my scroll to be true. In 2020, my mom and I decided to go on an overnight camping trip together on the Oregon coast. I picked what looked like a pretty campsite from a campsite app, and off we went. When we got there, We realized it was right off the highway, but there was enough trees and a fence up front that you couldn't really see the road. But the gate was just a metal gate that swung into place. No locks. There was a house on either side, but the property was fenced in on both sides. We pitched the tent pretty far back close to the woods on the back of the property. The closest house was about 100 yards away, and the highway was about 200 yards. But again, it was all mostly fenced in and surrounded by tall firs. It was a lovely sight, and my mom raved about how beautiful and peaceful it was. I will say that I got a feeling of dread as soon as we walked onto the property. But we arrived late, and I didn't know if we'd be able to get a new spot quickly. My mom could tell I was nervous, but for some reason, I put her enjoyment of the beauty of the campsite over my feeling of dread. We made a nice campfire and enjoyed some hot chocolate as we watched the fire. I kept an eye out and didn't see or hear anything odd. My mom went to bed before I did, and I stayed up and watched the fire for a long time before going to bed myself. Finally, I tucked in, very exhausted from staying up. At about 2 a.m., I awoke to twigs snapping and what sounded like someone dragging their fingers on the side of the tent, up to the front. I sat up and grabbed my phone, and the only weapon I had, a large flashlight, and unzipped my sleeping bag in case I needed to fight anyone. There was a full moon that night, and I couldn't tell if it was a person's shadow falling on the tent or if it was a tree branch shadow moving from the wind. It sounded like there were two people outside trying to be quiet. We had brought our boots inside, so there was no indicator outside of who was in the tent. It felt like they were trying to gauge the tent while I was listening for where they were. I had made sure to make enough noise so they knew someone inside was alert, but no more than that. If they knew someone is awake, they can't surprise us. But they also don't know who is inside and whether or not we have guns. I sat there in the dark until dawn. My mom seemed to sleep through the whole thing. When we got up and out of the tent, small things had been moved. Our camp chairs had cup holders. One cup that had been in a cup holder was on the ground. A pen that had been in a cup holder was also on the ground. My mom raves about how good her sleep was and how refreshing it was to camp there, so I didn't want to burst her bubble or scare her. We packed up and I didn't tell her anything, but let her have a nice memory of deep rest and relaxation while camping on this beautiful property. Was it someone living in the woods? Someone walking down the highway in the middle of the night? Creepy neighbors? Who knows? My mom had a great experience, and I got a refund and a fear of camping. The property owner said they might set up cameras to keep an eye on things in the future. People scare more than almost anything else that could be out there. Anyway, always listen to your gut. We should have found another campsite or, at least, a hotel. Please bear with me on this one, as I had asked my mom for the detailed version of the story and thought I'd share it with you kind people. This happened circa 1971 or 1972, when my mother was about 14 or 15 years old. The incident occurred in a heavily wooded area near Montevallo, Alabama, close to Birmingham. My mother is the oldest of 5 children. She has 3 sisters and a brother, who was the baby of the family. One weekend, in the cooler months of the fall, my grandfather decided to take the whole family, my grandmother, my mother, and all my aunts and uncles, so 7 people total, into the woods for target practice with a rifle. My mother grew up quite poor, and they didn't always live in the best neighborhoods. So my grandfather wanted to teach the kids how to defend themselves with the rifle, if need be. Like I said, it was later in the fall, so the trees were bare, and there were lots of leaves on the ground. The wooded area was just off a dirt road, so this was a fairly rural area they were in. Since it was so far off the beaten path, my grandfather became startled when he heard the roar of a car engine so deep in the woods. My mom remembers the car as being a blue Ford Galaxy. Despite the fact that my grandfather had a gun, he totally freaked out and told my grandma and the kids to hide under a pile of leaves in the woods. He hid with them. The man in the driver's seat got out, dragged a woman's body out of the car, and just dumped her there in the woods and drove away. After my grandfather was sure the man was gone, everyone came out of hiding, and the woman sat up and stared them straight in the face. My grandfather asked the woman if she needed help. She said no, she would be fine. She didn't seem to be injured and obviously didn't want help. She hadn't put up a fight with the man when he was dragging her out of the car. Maybe she must have known him. So, my grandfather cut the shooting lesson short and decided to rush the kids home to safety. Well, on the trail back to the dirt road where my grandfather had parked their car, they passed the man in the blue Ford Galaxy driving out of the woods. My mom looked over and noticed that he had a huge machete laying across the front seat right beside him. My grandfather made sure that the man could see that he was carrying a rifle, but everyone was careful not to give away what they had just seen. The man struck up small talk with my grandfather, asked him how he was doing, and what they were doing out in the woods. My grandfather explained that he had just taken his family out for some target practice with the rifle. The man told him to have a nice day and continued driving. The next day, my grandfather went back out to that spot in the woods. There was not a body there. However, he did find the woman's wig, her purse, some Kleenex, and a pair of eyeglasses. He collected the items and took them home. According to my grandfather, that area of the woods was known for having shallow graves and being a dumping site for bodies. My mother became hysterical when he walked in the door carrying that stuff. She started screaming, "He killed that lady! He killed that lady!" My grandfather ended up taking the items to the police station, but my mom doesn't think anything ever came of it. She never heard anything else about it after that. Well, she did hear one other thing about it, I guess. Early the next morning, my grandmother called my mom when she arrived at work, just before the kids left for school. She told them not to take the bus that day, that she would come home and pick them up and drive them to school. When my mom asked why, my grandmother said, "Because that car is waiting for you at the bus stop." My family and I went on a trip to the Hocking Hills area of southern Ohio a few weeks ago. There was a place that I always wanted to visit, the abandoned ghost town Moonville Rail Tunnel. I have never been to this area, so I didn't know what to expect, but I did know it was pretty deep in the woods. We took a trip from our rented cabin using Google for GPS to the location. We start driving and it's, for lack of better words, real impoverished where we are driving, and hills have eyes-esque. We literally only see a few cars on the way there and are on back roads. We get to a point where we need to enter into a forest, and we are close to the tunnel. There was a sign that said we were entering Backwoods. For a little additional information, I drive a Mercedes that I am just lucky to have, and have my husband in the car, a black man with dreadlocks, my 10-year-old nonverbal autistic son, and my 6-year-old daughter. We drive down this real creepy stone road into the forest, and there is nothing back there. No houses, no cars, nobody. We see signs that we are close and pull in the parking lot. We see a footbridge and walk over it and make our way toward the tunnel, which is a lot larger than I expected. We hear this sound coming from the other side of the tunnel that goes into the woods away from the parking lot. A truck comes driving through the tunnel towards us while we are on foot. He gets out of his truck with a chainsaw, and it's a white guy in his 60s. He walks with my entire family everywhere we go and through the tunnel. I tried to make small talk with him and pull some info about if he worked for the Department of Natural Resources, etc. He really wasn't budging. We turn around to walk out of the tunnel, and he starts using a chainsaw behind us, and the sound is just echoing through this tunnel. At this point, we have no cell phone service, and literally no one knows my family is out there except us. I was already worried my car was sending the wrong idea to people, like we have money or something, in which we don't. We rush to the car to get the kids in their booster seats, and this mother effer comes driving over the footbridge in his truck towards us in the parking lot. I honestly don't even know how his truck fit on it. He stops again and gets out of his truck and starts walking the other direction, much to our relief. About this time, I notice there are dusty handprints on my car. I asked my husband if they were his, and we compared his hand and my son's, and they were not a match. I don't know who could have touched the car because we were with the chainsaw man the entire time we were there. We get out of there as fast as possible. Just a few minutes later, I look in my rearview mirror, and there is a bunch of dust kicked up behind us, and there he is. He had to have driven pretty fast on the stone road to catch up to us like that. There is nowhere to go in these woods. The road is basically one lane, and we have no cell service or GPS. Every time I think we lose him, he is there again. I'm waiting for my tires to get popped or something, or for this guy to ram me off the road into a ravine in the woods. Finally, we get out of this woods and I turn out, and he's still following us. We were following printed directions to get back, and I ended up making a wrong turn in the excitement. The guy in the truck was finally gone, and I turned around to go back past the stone road that goes into the forest. There is one lone house near this road, and there is his truck, parked there. He had to have seen us drive onto this road into the woods, and taken some back way to the tunnel. I don't know if he was just trying to protect the site from more graffiti or what, but he really creeped us the hell out. It was like every scary movie trope rolled into one single event. This is actually my stepmom's and her best friend's story. She calls this her stranger danger encounter. My stepmom, we're going to call her Macy, grew up as a kind of a privileged teen in the 70s, and her mom had moved their family over here, the States, from England when she was about 9. She went to a pretty nice high school in a really nice town. There, she made friends with a girl, Lily, who didn't exactly run with Macy's type of crowd. Popular, stereotypical, etc. They really hit it off, and Lily would take Macy out to do her type of stuff. Hiking, fishing, sailing. There's even a hilarious set of pictures of them camping. My stepmom has raccoon eyes and looks like she hates everything. Anyways, because of Lily's influence, the two of them would do stuff like that a good amount of times. One Sunday, they decided to go hike in some hills about an hour away. Macy put on what I'm sure were her extremely expensive hiking shoes, and the two of them drove off to the hiking trails. Lily parked in this big clearing with makeshift parking spots. You know, like a piece of wood marking the head of a space. But there were no other cars there. This was only important in hindsight. They started hiking up the hill, off the path because Lily fancied herself as something of a badass. The hike was nothing extraordinary. If you asked my stepmom, she would just lament for 15 minutes how sticky and buggy it was. Anyways, they reached the top of the hill, and my stepmom was done. The polished, pampered side of her was coming out, and she groaned until Lily, begrudgingly, said okay. They would rest and then walk down again, slower. They had been heading down the hill for maybe 10 minutes when Macy started bitching again. Lily conceded to walking down the side of the road instead of the rough hiking trail. So, there they are, probably looking like a couple of tools geared up for hiking and walking down a crappy road. and after not even 5 minutes, a truck pulled up next to them. It was red and rusty and just generally looked like a clunker. The guy driving rolled down the window, and the girls looked in through the passenger side window. He had a big beard, a baseball cap pulled down, and long brown hair. He greeted them and even smiled through his beard, asking if they needed a ride. Macy described him as charming and even cute. Lily still says the moment he greeted them, her hackles went up. Despite her better judgment, my stepmom convinced her to get in the truck. It must only be a 10-minute drive down to the car, tops. The two girls opened the passenger's door to this rusty old thing, and the guy directed them behind the seat to get into the back. They settled in and the truck started rumbling forwards. Lily always says that was the point it hit her what a mistake they had just made. The back seat was clean enough, but there was a rope on the floor behind the driver's seat and 4 boxes of saran wrap half hanging out from under the passenger seat. It seemed creepy and weird, but Lily didn't want to freak my stepmom out, so she just kept her mouth shut. After 10 minutes, the woods didn't look any clearer, and they hadn't seen another car the whole time. Lily asked how long he thought it would be. He said he was taking a different route down the hill and had to stop somewhere to get something first. That was it. The girls were only 16 and 17, and Lily didn't want to press the issue. She was scared. She can remember his hair because she was sitting behind him. He looked like a woodsy guy, but his hair was super tangled and dirty. She noticed crusted mud on his collar and tried to find something identifiable about him, but just got scared the more she picked up on little details. He was young-ish, strong-looking, and easily had 1 foot on both of them. So they didn't ask any more questions, and he didn't offer any more information, and they continued to drive on. Several minutes after that, they reached a tiny shack or log cabin looking place right there in a clearing of trees. There was an old stump where someone had been chopping wood, and a huge axe stuck into the log. Lily was definitely on red alert now. The guy turned off the truck and slipped out of it saying, "I'll be right back. Don't get out." And he disappeared into the house. Lily tried to talk to my stepmom about how she was incredibly uncomfortable, but she mostly just dismissed it. Lily started begging, increasingly freaked out, and finally put her foot down, demanding Macy exited the truck with her. So they got out and walked around the front of the vehicle. The house was about 50 yards in front of them. Why this guy would have left 2 young girls in the truck alone while going into the house is beyond me. And they wandered around, looking at it hesitantly. If this guy really was decent and just trying to give them a ride, it would be super rude to just run off, right? My stepmom had this strict upbringing when it came to manners and a public persona, and she saw it as an issue of that nature. So she actually started to head back to the truck, opening the front door to climb in behind the driver's seat Lily was pissed off and followed her to yell some more. On the driver's side floor, half hidden under the seat, was a big hatchet. It had dried red and brown stains covering the blade and stuck to the floor under it. Lily understandably lost her shit, and seeing it, my stepmom started getting hysterical. They decided that leaving was by far their best option at this point, and just booked it off the side of property into the trees. They bumbled around in the trees for a little while, until Lily was fairly confident they were on their way back down the hill. My stepmom cried all the way down. Lily felt bad about it, but was also completely freaked out that he would heart it and kept trying to calm her down. When they finally got back down to the bottom and saw the old wooden fence that surrounded the original parking area, they were relieved. But as they got closer, they saw it. The truck. It was parked on the other side of the gravelly makeshift lot, just sitting there, facing the other way, innocently. They couldn't see if anyone was in it, and of course Macy wanted to run for the car, but Lily was super hesitant. She managed to calm my stepmom down, saying she wanted to wait before running out into the open to see what was out there. Remember, this is the 70s, so no cell phones. There was no ranger station or anyone else around. The parking lot was big and empty and open, and who knows what would have happened if they decided to stroll across it. Thankfully, Lily convinced my stepmom to chill, and the two of them hunkered down against a big tree, hidden by bushes and other trees, and waited it out for what seemed to be a couple of hours, when darkness started to fall. All the animals started coming out and making noises, and my stepmom, predictably, started getting antsy about this and bothering Lily, who was tired and moments away from giving in. She was just planning their dash to the car when they heard a clunk. Across the twilight-lit lot, they watched as one of the back doors of their car swung open, and the bearded guy slid his way out of the back seat. He got out, shut the door, looked around at the surrounding woods for several moments, and then walked back to his truck. The truck lumbered past their car and out of sight. Several minutes after watching him drive away, they sprinted to their car as fast as they could, jumped in, and peeled out before they even shut the doors. If this guy is still alive, he's really old, but still, he could still be out there, hunting down other young girls, just like my stepmom and her best friend. I took a trip to stay in a cabin in the middle of the woods high up in the mountains of the city of Ranger, Georgia, USA. This neighborhood was 30 minutes up in the mountains, away from civilization, and even the cabins were spread far apart. The front deck of the cabin was completely exposed to the woods, so I acknowledged that any animals could stroll along if they pleased. But I stayed there for about a week, and me and my boyfriend sat outside on the front deck every night, very late, and at no point felt in danger. It was peaceful with fireflies out and sounds of crickets every night. Until the fifth night, it was eerily dark too, The moon was covered heavily. It was about midnight, and all of a sudden, I didn't feel peace like I did those other nights. The forest went completely quiet, and I felt a horrible sense of dread. I genuinely feared for my life. I sat there in my chair, looking out into the dark forest, trying to rationalize and calm myself down that it was my mind playing tricks. But all of a sudden, my boyfriend said out loud that he, too, felt unsafe. That's when I realized it just wasn't me. We then both heard a blood-curdling scream, and we pulled out a flashlight to see what it was. Turns out it was a gray fox. They make scary screaming sounds. The weird part was that the fox was running and had its ears and tail down like it was scared. This was in June, and I read that foxes scream like that when it's mating season, or if they're in danger. Their mating season is winter, and this happened in June. So I do believe this fox was in danger or afraid as well, adding to our fear. The cabin has 3 floors, and we were able to climb out the window and sit on the roof because we wanted to still be outside and relax. It didn't matter how high up I was. I felt something truly evil and stayed inside. The only other time I felt something so evil or like someone was watching was when I had a few paranormal experiences at a haunted house. Georgia doesn't really get mountain lions that often. Maybe a bear, but it didn't feel that way at all. It felt unnatural. And that, dear listeners, is the end of these more true backwoods creepy. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you kindly. If you are awake, I hope you have enjoyed this collection of stories. In the meantime, I'll read to you soon. Have yourself a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good night.